I'm here at the FantasyCon 2019 in sunny Clydebank at the Golden Jubilee Hotel and Conference Centre with Dan Coxon, editor of Tales from the Shadow Booth, which had its launch yesterday, or rather Volume 4 had its launch yesterday. This is the fourth volume in the series. Dan, tell us about the Shadow Booth. What is it?
Okay, so we've done 4 volumes in 3 years now, which has kept me very busy. The idea behind it has always been to publish the kind of weird and uncanny and strange stories. I quite often said to the writers to send me the things that they loved, that they had written, but that nobody else would take because they were too odd. I was kind of looking for those odd stories that were just a bit too out there to kind of fit in with other magazines. And yeah, to date we've had some fantastic people. Volume 1 had Paul Tremblay, Alison Moore. 2 had people like Mark Morris. 3 we had Rob Shearman. We've had Leah Whiteley. This one's the latest one, just there. We have Gary Budden, Lucy McKnight Hardy, whose debut came out this year, which is an amazing book. Marion Womack, who's also amazing. So we're just kind of, I like gathering writers. It's about gathering writers who I like, essentially.
Yeah, these are some great names. How do you find these writers? How do you bring people together for these collections?
We've had a combination, actually. So it's been a combination of inviting people whose work I've read and really enjoyed, and open submissions. We did have open submissions for this Volume 4 and for Volume 3. I got a lot of submissions.
Yes.
Upwards of 400 for this volume. So in terms of the amount of time that it took to work through it, that took a lot of time. But just looking at it now, there's at least about 7, I think, that came through that open submissions period.
Wow. 7 out of 400.
Yeah. I mean, the odds are against you, to be fair. But I think because of that, we get the cream of the crop. I mean, there were stories I turned down that actually were very, very good stories. They either just didn't make the cut or they just weren't quite right for us. But there was nothing wrong with them, and I did say to those people that, there's nothing wrong with your story. It's just not one of those 7, unfortunately.
It is quite an open theme.
Yes.
So that casting the net, I mean, you say the weirdest of the weird, but it's still casting the net quite wide among horror writers.
I quite like waiting to see what happens. There's an element of kind of chance thrown into the mix. So, for example, this latest one, Volume 4, has quite a kind of folk horror vibe to it. Not because I intentionally did that, but just because the stories I got sent and the ones that came through were very much in that kind of vein.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I mean, it's quite a privileged position to be in, almost, to be having all these new stories coming towards you. You must be able to get see a sense of almost the fashions in the kind of stories that people are writing.
And it quite often comes through in each one. So with Volume 3, it was much more of a weird fiction kind of vibe to it. There's not so much of the kind of eerie horror stuff. It's more just kind of slightly unsettling. Robert Shearman's story in it, I Say, is a prime example. It's very funny. It's very funny and very entertaining, but also quite unsettling. But it's not what you would call a horror story.
In the evening they took turns to cook, roast beef in Yorkshire pudding, haggis with tatties, Irish stew. They didn't necessarily cook what you might expect them to cook. The Scotsman, for example, had a way with Irish stew, and the Englishman's tatties were second to none. Their kitchen skills were quite varied, and in their private lives they sought to avoid cultural stereotyping as much as possible.
And it probably wouldn't fit into Volume 4, but it fitted perfectly into Volume 3. And it's quite interesting to see those kind of things just emerging. They've almost emerged by themselves. It's not something I've necessarily kind of going with an agenda. I just kind of wait and see what happens. Usually I get 2 or 3 people on board at first who I want to work with, and then just kind of see where it goes from there.
I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you if you can give us an insight into the kind of stories that you can find in Volume 4 by telling me just a vague bit about one of the plots, say, one of the situations that somebody.
Okay, well, I could probably do a couple, to be honest. So we have a wonderful one. There's a story by James Mackin in it, which the basic premise, the concept of it is that they go for a family trip to visit this person who's vaguely a kind of uncle or family friend, and they then leave one of their family members there and just forget about them, and they just get wiped out of the family history, and it's never kind of explained. And it's that lack of explanation which I quite like. I like the ambiguous. One of the reasons we have people like kind of Paul Tremblay in the first issue and stuff, he does ambiguous very well.
He's known for his ambiguity.
He is. And it's that kind of thing. It's that kind of vibe. I love that kind of. You're not quite sure what happened, but something quite odd and unsettling has happened. I always refer to Robert Aikman and Thomas Ligotti as two of the big kind of influences on the journal for that very reason. They both wrote stories that were quite often inexplicable, but somehow just affected you on a slightly deeper level. You couldn't quite work it out kind of cerebrally, but on some deeper level they just unsettled you.
And the shadow booth itself, what is the concept of the shadow booth?
Yeah, that was an interesting thing. So when I was setting up Volume 1 and I was trying to come up with a name for it, I was trying to think of things that like really unsettled me, and Punch and Judy booths was one of them.
Yeah.
And I can't call it the Punch and Judy booth. And then Shadow seemed to be the perfect word to put with it. So it became the Shadow booth. But I do write then, there's an introduction to each volume called Enter the Shadow Booth, in which there's a very short story about somebody encountering this odd booth that they wander into. And there's a vague kind of concept around the series that these are all the odd stories inside the booth. These are the weird stories that happen in this odd liminal space that doesn't exist.
Well, if only it did. Or maybe it does. Maybe it does.
I hope it doesn't. Not for me anyway. I'm not going there.
You had the launch of Volume 4 yesterday.
Yes.
How have you found FantasyCon this year?
It's been a really good year, actually. It's been interesting. I feel like some of the people I've been used to seeing at FantasyCons haven't been there here this year, so I wasn't sure how it was going to pan out. But actually, been a really receptive group of people. We sold a ton of books, which is always good.
Yeah.
And yeah, I find always at these things the sense of community really comes through. These are people who maybe see each other once or twice a year, and yet we're all kind of pulling in the same direction and rooting for each other and supporting each other with all our new projects. And I love that about FantasyCon, and I'm loving that again this year.
And of course you have the wonderful weather.
You do.
Catching the best of.
We've almost got the sunset coming over there as well, actually.
It's magical. Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you.